Welcome to the weekend, gang. It's officially weekend time now, 5 o'clock New York time Friday. Of course, it's 10 o'clock over in Scotland, so they've already started. We'll get to that in just a minute. Those of you on the West Coast, it's still only 2 o'clock, but we now officially give you permission to start your weekend right now. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio in New Jersey, and it's our happy hour live webcast. We do this every Friday. Come hell or high water, technical difficulties or no. And we've had a few of those lately. Hopefully today we get through without the technical snafus that we've had the last couple of weeks, but we're going to have a lot of fun over the next hour or so. Want to bring in our guests, our pals Findlay Ross and Ranald Watson from Springbank Distillery and J&A Mitchell. Guys, how are you today?
Yeah, very well. Thanks, Mark. Thank you for having us on. It's nice to see you.
And Findlay, how are you doing? What's in your glass tonight?
Yes, equally well. Unsurprisingly, I've got a Springbank 10-year-old cracked open tonight, so I'm very much enjoying that. As you say, it's just gone 10 o'clock here, so very much whiskey hour.
And we are getting some comments from folks online already about what they have in their glasses, and folks drinking Lagavulin, a little bit of, Dave Kuhn had some Springbank 12 Cask-Strength in his place. Tyrone Cote had some Blantons, and the Master of Malt Whiskey bracket on Twitter. You guys didn't fix that bracket, did you, to get Springbank up to the top of it? It looks like it's Bunnahabhain and Lagavulin.
Yeah, we needed to do a better job there. Eh?
And Donner Pass Whiskey loves everything Springbank does, just wish fewer people did too. You guys pretty much don't have to advertise. You sell almost everything you make, and it's really one of the more underrated distilleries out there because you don't have to blow your own horn too much, do you?
No, luckily not. Being family owned, our chairman's the great grandson of the guy who first distilled on the site of Springbank, and so we're not shareholder owned or led. We're not driven by profits or whatever. We make as much as we can realistically make. We employ a lot of people to do it, and people enjoy it, in a great number of ways. So that means there's less of it available than people want to get. So it makes my job relatively straightforward.
Findlay, let's talk about what's happening at the distillery these days. I know you were saying before we started that you're just doing the annual transition over from Springbank up to Glengyle, right?
Yeah, that's right. We tend to distill up at Springbank between sort of January and early September, and then we kind of move everybody up to Glengyle to start making Clocairn. So it's the same guys that work at both sites, and so we can get the crossover as tight as possible, but there's always a bit of a clear-cut line between when we finish distilling at Springbank and when we can distill at Glengyle. And I think, as you touched upon before, I think everyone would love to have more Springbank available on the market. We've done our bit in the last 3 years in terms of increasing production, but obviously with the nature of Scotch whisky and how long it takes between when you increase production and when that product gets on the market, we're still a few years away from that.
Ranald, what's in your glass tonight?
I've gone into some of my old stock. This is a 14-year-old local barley Springbank, which was bottled for our Springbank Society, a good number of years ago now. I can't remember exactly the year, but probably 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe even more than that. I had a little bit left kicking about the bottom of a bottle, and I thought tonight would be the right occasion to polish that one off.
And we're already getting our first criticism of the night from Tabitha, Spirit Bomb in England. Surely the demand is there to keep both distilleries open all year round. Why don't you?
Ranald, do you want to take this one?
I'll take that one. It's twofold. In an ideal world, I suppose you would say you want to distill just under demand. Because you don't want to be, we're not a company set up to be, we don't intend to have our whiskey everywhere. We don't like to try and sell it. We want people to buy it. As Greg has been saying in the chat, word of mouth sells Springbank better than anyone who works at the distillery ever can, because it's an organic support and love that the products get from the Springbank fans. But in practical terms, we do 100% of our own malting at the distillery. So the biggest limit we have on production is how much malt we can physically work with in a year. So it's not so much distillation capacity that's an issue, but it's malting capacity. And it's not easy to install another malt floor. It's not, not something we can just decide to do. And we've got the added complication, I suppose, in that we also run Glengyle Distillery, as Findlay said, for 10 to 12 weeks of the year. And so that's 10 to 12 weeks working at Glengyle, where we could arguably be working at Springbank. But then you'd either have to make no malt at Glengyle or commit to fully producing there all year round, which is something the company's definitely aiming to do. But it's not just as simple as, great, we'll just bring in 6 more people and we'll distill for 12 months of the year and we'll get loads more whiskey out of Glengyle, because you need more warehousing, you need more malt, you need more malting capacity. So it's a big picture, and being, the advantage of being a small company is having control over everything you do. The disadvantage is that, we don't have a shareholder base to go and tap into for some millions to fund expansion and stuff. So it has to happen gradually and over time. And as Findlay said, we increased production almost nearly double across the board 3 years ago. So there is a bit more coming. It's just not coming as quickly as everybody would like to see it.
We have a question from Donner Pass Whisky. Is Kilkerran made with the same in-house floor malted barley done at Springbank?
So the expressions that people will be familiar with in terms of Kilkerran 12-year-olds, the kind of flagship dram out of Glengyle is made with the exact same malt. It's quite interesting because we've had analysis done on both the spirits, both Springbank and Kilkerran, and the ppm's different, and that's purely down to the processing difference. Springbank 2.5 times distilled with different shape stills and a slightly different process, and up at Glengyle it's just the more traditional 2 times distilled, slightly higher reflux rate, and even that's enough to give you a fairly significantly different base spirit, but still very much in the Campbeltown style.
We have a comment from Dave Kuhn, who was going to visit Springbank in a couple of weeks, but they're shutting down the airport in Campbeltown to resurface the tarmac, and he's really disappointed. Is that affecting your visitor numbers at all with those plans? I know that COVID has really cut into it, right?
It seems that the tarmacking of the airport has cost us at least one visitor in poor Dave there, but most of our visitors tend to travel by road. In many ways, it is more reliable. It's quite unusual for them to close the whole airport for 5 or 6 weeks, as they are doing. But because the plane that they used to take you to Campbeltown was so small, it's very much at the mercy of the elements. On a wild, windy day, the flight doesn't go. So people who definitely want to make sure they get to Campbeltown tend to do it by road. Now, the difference is the flight takes 30, 40 minutes. The drive takes 3.5 to 4 hours if you're doing it on the bus. If you're doing a car, it'll take you about 3. And you don't need to worry about driving on the wrong side of the road, because much of the road is so narrow there aren't really sides to it. But yeah, the big problem we've had with visitor numbers has obviously been COVID, and we were without any visitors for about 14 months. We decided, even when we restarted production just over a year ago, that until we were sure we could put processes in place to protect visitors, protect staff, that we weren't going to take any risks just for the sake of getting people back through the doors. So we've only really been taking visitors again since June of this year, and we're building that back up gradually. But we're getting ready to see more people as soon as they're allowed to come, really.
And Dave Watchman 999 up in Canada says, hopefully they're extending the tarmac to allow for A380s to land. I don't think so.
You could land an A380 in Campbeltown Airport, no bother. It's the 4th or 5th longest runway in Europe. Believe it or believe it not, you could land a space shuttle on it.
Once.
Yeah, but it's because it's an ex-military base. It's got a very, very long runway, and you could land any size of aircraft on it just about.
Findlay, let's talk about, well, before we get to that, those visitors who do make it to Campbeltown, since Dave's not going to make it, he's going to miss out on your brand new bar that you guys opened up, right?
He is, unfortunately for him, yeah.
Tell us about it.
Go for it, Findlay. It's closer to your office than mine, Findlay, so you can
It is, yeah. I mean, I think I've been at Springbank for about 6 years now, give or take. And when I first started there, what is now the new washback bar was the joiner's shop. So that's where a lot of the window frames and the doors and the running repairs to the distillery were done. And when you went into it, when it looked like that, you could not at any point imagine it could be anything else other than a joiner's store. But I'm sure Ranald will attest to the fact that it's been transformed into a really, a really interesting visitor attraction. The centerpiece bar is made out of an old washback from Glengyle that had kind of served its time and needed to be repurposed. And it's just a really interesting addition to the visitor experience at Springbank Distillery. So we opened that, a kind of soft open, I would say, last Friday, a week ago tonight, actually, where we invited some local guests, people that were members of the society that were kind of within driving distance of Campbeltown, and took people in, it kind of gave them a tour around. Obviously, drams were available as well, which were more than readily accepted by the visitors. And so, I mean, I can only tell you what I see from my distillery window, but it certainly seems to have been very popular. And that very first opening day on Monday, the 10 o'clock tour was busier than I've ever seen a 10 o'clock tour, because it finished off by finishing its tour into the bar. And they were the first people really to be able to be guests there.
And as Graham Fraser points out, the bus from Glasgow to Campbeltown is part of the adventure. And Dave Kuhn says next time he'll be back for Phage next year, and we'll pop over for a day, and hopefully you guys will have the Campbeltown Malts Festival and be able to hold it in person this year, or this coming year.
We certainly hope so. You know, we always hold the Campbeltown Festival in the days leading up to the Isla Festival, so that people who are coming over for one can also do the other if they're so inclined. So at this stage, the plan is very much to get back to a real life people on the ground festival next year. So fingers crossed that comes to pass.
Findlay, tell me about the changes that you guys have made in production for sustainability, because I know that you're switching some of the fuel sources around and trying to make some changes that might not be completely traditional at Springbank, but will set you up for the next 100 years or so, right?
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, I think the biggest difficulty really at Springbank is that it is, to coin a phrase, a working museum. You know, it hasn't really changed all that much in the 200 years that it's operated, and things have been upgraded, with kind of not quite a grudge, but there's a lot of thought goes into any changes to any of the production equipment, and so from that point of view, the distillery was set up without any sort of efficiency in mind. You know, it was set up when water was readily available, when fuel sources were readily available, and people didn't really think too much about the longer term implications of distilling and the impact that might have on the local area and the planet at large. So when we look at it now and we think, okay, you know, we live in the modern world, we need to be able to make Springbank, make sure it's still the same spirit that everyone loves. We don't want to mess around with the fact that it is a unique and distinct dram that has a world-class reputation, but what can we do around that process to use less energy and be less polluting and have less emissions? So we're really in the midst of a bit of a moratorium on how we do things. And so one of the things we've been able to identify is that our boilers, both at Springbank and Glengyle, they run off of red diesel, which, as I'm sure many people know, is not the most environmentally friendly fuel. And so we're looking to switch that out to LPG in the sort of short to medium term, which will really help with our emissions. So we'll be able to reduce not just our carbon footprint, but also our kind of nitrous oxide and sulfur oxide emissions as well. The change in fuel source will not affect your spirit in any way, shape, or form. The fuel's just there to power the boiler that gives you the steam that allows you to fire up the stills and make the whiskey. But it will reduce our impact on the environment. And we're also looking at similar things to do with water that feeds our cooling towers and our boilers as well. How can we reduce the amount of water we need to use? How can we get more efficient with how we use water on site? But I think the important thing to stress, as we kind of talked about actually at the launch of the bar, is that we don't plan to change Springbank in any way, shape or form. I think that would be idiocy and absolute suicide. We don't want to adjust anything to do with the dram itself. What we want to do is try and make sure that the things that don't affect the final spirit, can we do them more efficiently, more effectively? Can we reduce our impact on the environment? And it's not an easy job, certainly. You know, as I say, the distillery is the best part of 200 years old and nobody designed it to be energy efficient. So kind of reverse engineering that's very, very challenging. But we are looking at it with as fine a tooth comb as we can.
And Ranald, I want to bring you in to talk about the packaging side, because in conjunction with that announcement on switching from diesel to LP gas, you guys also said you're going to stop with all the canisters and boxes and all the other stuff that goes along with the whiskey bottles, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're pretty much effective immediately on our kind of core range, more readily available whiskies. So our Springbank 10, 12 and 15, Hazelburn 10, Longrow Peated, Kilkerran 8, 12 and 16. We're going to be shipping those out from the distillery without any sort of unnecessary exterior packaging. Now, getting rid of some cardboard boxes or some tubes isn't going to save the planet, but it's going to be better for it than not getting rid of them. And we're pretty firmly of the belief that, you know, so I would imagine 90% of people who are drinking Springbank or who are buying Springbank aren't buying it because it's got a box with it. They're buying it for what's inside the bottle, you know, and I don't think this is a change that can do anybody any harm. And it can only do a little bit of good. We'll have a new way of shipping our six packs and stuff to protect the bottles and the labels to make up for any perceived sort of difference from not having outer packaging. But yeah, we feel that it's the right thing to do. Our older or more exclusive expressions, where maybe they're being bought for a slightly different purpose, maybe not all of them are being bought for immediate consumption, we're reviewing their packaging as well to see how locally can we source that, can we make sure it's all from either recycled or reusable materials or something that we can sort of provide as a secondary use for people. Just as Findlay says, to be that little bit more aware. You know, it's not about trying to change what we do. It's not about trying to save the planet all in one go. But if everybody can do their own little bit that shouldn't affect their product and how it tastes, then there's no real reason not to do it in our eyes.
What about the peat? I know you guys use just a little bit of local peat, right?
We haven't used any local peat. Certainly the time I've been here. Ranald, you've been with the company a bit longer than me. It's certainly, you know, at least 10, 15 years, I would say, since any local peat was used. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, it's been quite some time since there was any peat really being cut for anything other than, you know, maybe somebody's own farm or someone's own kind of, it's not so much a croft, but, you know, their country house or whatever. So there's not a lot of peat being cut or harvested in Kintyre. So it's been a number of years since we've been using that. Our peat tends to come from much further north these days.
We have a good question now from Whiskey Canuck in Canada. Not sure he's ever seen an independent bottling of Springbank casks since your whiskey is so much in demand. Is that something that's just not in the business model at this time? If there were going to be an independent bottling, theoretically, it would come out through your Cadenhead's arm, right? You don't sell to many of the blenders or the brokers, do you?
No, that's right. We haven't sold a cask to anyone out with our own company, so Cadenhead, since 2001. Pretty much from about the mid 1990s up to 2001, literally anyone could buy one. Blender, broker, bottler, private individual. But, you know, compared to how little they were distilling in those days, they sold such a high proportion of casks. That's part of the reason why we've been so short of stock over the years. So in 2001, it was decided that every single cask we distilled would be kept for our own purposes. And as you rightly point out, Mark, we actually do bottle some Springbank through Cadden Heads. We usually do a Springbank, a Long Row, maybe a Kilkerran every year under the Cadden Head label, but those tend to be part of the Cadden Heads Authentic collection, which is only available through our 8 Cadden Head stores in the UK and Europe. So it's quite unusual to see an independently bottled Springbank, and any you do see now will all have been distilled prior to 2001, because, as I say, since that date we've not sold a drop to anybody unless it's been in a bottle.
And Graham Fraser wants to know, what's the relationship between Springbank and Cadden Heads in terms of casks and bottle releases? How closely do you coordinate? Since I'm assuming you pretty much coordinate all that, Ranald, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I perform the same function for both sides of our business. So for the 2 distilleries and for Cadden Heads, I look after the overall kind of sales and marketing. So we work now pretty closely on that. A lot of the casks that are owned by Cadden Heads are matured up at the distillery. Findlay keeps an eye on those. If any we want re-racked into alternative cask types, again, Findlay's got a good supply of different types of barrels at the distillery, so we borrow a few of those. And then obviously they're all bottled up at the distillery as well. So yeah, there's a pretty close relationship between the two now.
We have a question from Greg in Paris. Any plans for a permanent Hazelburn 18-year-old version or a Long Row 12 cask strength, or both? And I think he'd like both.
I would like both too, but I don't think Findlay's going to let us.
No, I'd love both as well. I think the thing about the production kind of history at Springbank has been that, as Ranald touched upon, it tended to be when there was lots of money available, we would produce a lot of whiskey, and when there wasn't so much, it would be a bit more of a fallow year, or there'd be a bit more of a conservative production schedule put together. So there isn't really a lot of consistency from a production point of view to work with in that regard. And so I think, myself and Ranald would both love to have consistent age statements of every single product going from here until the year dot. But unfortunately, looking back in time and seeing how much was produced and where casks have been used, we are sort of in a sphere where we have to be able to release things when they're available, but they might not be able to be sustained for a 10-year period. But hopefully people enjoy them when they're there.
Yes, Springbank's, in a position where we've got a nice steady range of whiskies. Findlay's managed to control the stock to provide for that. But Long Row and Hazelburn are a bit more sporadic. We do have a 21-year-old Hazelburn that's coming out over the next few months. It'll be in reasonably limited supply, even by our standards. And that'll be the oldest Hazelburn we've officially bottled. It'll be the oldest Hazelburn we're able to bottle for some time, because we're using our oldest casks for it. But like anybody, anybody who's involved in bottling a distillery's products at the moment, or maturing them and looking after them, will all tell you we can only work with what the guys who came before us left us. So you kind of take what you've got and you work with it.
Findlay, you took over when Frank McHardy finally retired a couple of years ago and sort of went to emeritus status. What did he teach you? What are the best lessons that Frank McHardy taught you?
I think, slightly less so during the COVID period, but Frank has always been a frequent visitor to the distillery. I don't know if anyone who's listening has met Frank before, but he's very much in it. A man who's efficient with his time. So he's in, he's out, he gets done what he wants to. And if you want to ask him a question, you need to be quick, and you need to hope that the answer he can provide is going to satisfy what you were looking for. So I think from a kind of learning perspective with Frank, a lot of it has been through looking at the old records and seeing what he did, rather than necessarily, sitting and speaking to him. Because as you touched upon, Frank had kind of moved away from the business by the time I joined, but he left an indelible legacy on the company. And so whenever anything's cropped up historically that Frank was in charge of at the time, he's always at the end of the phone, and you can always chat to him. He's always more than willing to provide any information that you want. I think with regards to that, I think, Frank's very highly regarded for a reason. And so you'd be kind of really missing a trick by not tapping into at least a portion of that expertise. and we're quite lucky in the fact that Frank's more than willing to give that when it's asked of him. He actually prefers to talk about golf when he comes in now. I don't know if that's just as he's moved through retirement, but he quite often wants to find out how you played on a Saturday medal more than he does want to talk about what you're producing or what you're filling.
He's earned that right after so many years in the business, I think.
Absolutely.
I think from my perspective, Frank was, when I started with the company, Frank was just moving from distillery manager to production director, so he was kind of taking his final step up. And I think the biggest difference, during Frank's time has been the attention paid to the quality of casks we're using. I believe that when Frank came back to Springbank in about 1997, I think it was, after a spell running Bushmills, he made it his priority to go through pretty much the entire maturing stock and re-rack anything that he thought wasn't in a great standard of cask. So the casks that we've been sourcing, to a large degree, we keep buying from the guys Frank bought from because it's working. And that kind of attention to the maturation that everybody talks about now. Springbank's been paying that attention for 25 years or so, which I think helps or is reflected in the consistency of a lot of the whiskies that we're bottling now.
We have a comment. I don't know how serious this is, from our good friend David Sturck, who heard J&A Mitchell allegedly announced a new distillery to coincide with Springbank's 200th anniversary at the opening of the Washback bar. Let's just get the rumor control out of the way right now. Did you guys announce a new distillery?
Yes. We announced our intention that by the time the distillery reaches its 200th anniversary in about 7 years' time, that we will have plans in place for our third distillery. So it's an intention. It's not a firm, we can't tell you where it's going to be, what size it's going to be, who's going to build it or anything. Findlay's still at work on all of that, but it is our intention to add a third distillery to the company portfolio within the next half a dozen or so years. Whether we open it in time for the 200th anniversary or whether we start building on the 200th anniversary is still to be decided as well.
So you're basically teasing us right now.
A little bit. We had a lot of plans for the company that were to an extent put on hold during the beginnings of COVID and the pandemic and stuff. So there's a bit of catching up to do. So had it not been for the pandemic, we might have been slightly further down the road on this than we are now. But building another distillery while you're still running two and an independent bottler is going to be, it's going to be a big addition to the workload. So we want to take our time and make sure we do it right.
Will it be in Campbeltown?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I realise I may have gave the impression it might not be. No, absolutely. It'll be as close to our current sites as possible to make maturation and malting and all of that kind of stuff make sense.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. You're not running either Springbank or Glengyle full steam 24/7 all year round. Is there a demand to open a third distillery, and would that one run 24/7 all year round, or what?
Probably wouldn't run 24/7 all year round initially. We will probably get Glengyle running at least all year round before the new one does. But no, I think we thrive on small and different. We don't want to become big. Now we can certainly get a bit bigger, and we will. Again, the limit on expanding Glengyle is malting capacity. It's on warehousing. So we'll have plans in place to tackle all of that. But we think there is enough interest and enough demand in another new thing from us. We'd rather sell lots of little things than one big, massive, homogenized thing, whether that's a distillery image, a distillery tour. We want it to be small and idiosyncratic, I think, is the things we're good at. It's what we know how to do.
Well, I owe an apology to David Sturck because I thought he was just messing with us there. But thanks for helping us break some news there, guys.
David was fishing for information on that on Facebook earlier today, I noticed, but I don't know if anyone really took him on. So he's got his answer now, and there's an exclusive for WhiskyCast as well.
We appreciate it. Dave Kuhn wants to know, how do you guys define Campbeltown style whiskey?
Finlay, do you want to go first now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. As a Campbeltown born and bred man, you're probably in a slightly better position than me to answer this. I think from a production point of view and from what we look for when we're producing our whiskies to say, right, okay, yeah, that's definitely, what we're aiming at. Obviously, we've got Springbank, we've got Hazelburn, we've got Longrow, and we've got Kilkerran. Now, anyone that's tried all four of those drams will know that they do not all taste the same. As Ranald touched upon, there'd be no point in producing basically four, exactly the same homogenized whiskies. We're all about small scale and distinction between them. But I think as a unifying theme, we've always got that really kind of oily nature to them. We've always got that little bit of salt. Springbank, it's that touch of peat. I think, and it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but whenever we've done maybe tastings of different casks, or if we're sitting down and looking at a Cadenhead release, for example, that may include some Springbank that needs to be tasted in amongst that, you can always tell when you're sniffing a Springbank, the same way that I think you can always tell when you're sniffing a Longrow, and definitely when you're sniffing a Kilkerran. I think it's just the complexity. That's what I would always come back to with all these drams, is that there's a lot going on in them, which I know certainly for people who maybe are starting to get into whiskey isn't the first thing they're looking for. But certainly from our point of view, the layers and the complexity that are involved in both the spirits produced at Springbank and up at Glengyle are really the defining features. And as I say, it's that kind of oiliness, the little bit of brine, the little bit of peat that's involved in both Springbank and Kilkerran 12-year-old, for example, I think would be the touch points that I would always go back to.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of that at all. I think when you look at the traditional regional flavour profiles from Scotland, and I know people will argue now back and forth whether they're still maintaining any relevance or not in today's whiskey world, but if you would always say, Islas are peaty, Speysides are sweet and fruity, Highlands are floral, Lowlands are grassy and delicate. Campbeltown's almost a little bit of all of that. It's not overwhelmingly peaty. If you take Springbank anyway as the example, it's not overwhelmingly peaty, but it does have a bit of it. It's not a super fruity whiskey, but it's slightly fruity. It's definitely briny, it's definitely maritime, and it's those kind of elements, I think, that tend to define a Campbeltown whiskey. If you look at Glen Scotia, Glen Scotia and Springbank are two pretty different whiskies, but they do have at least that common factor, that salinity, that oiliness that Findlay talks about. And I think that's because both Springbank and Glen Scotia are throwbacks to a time from a long, long number of years ago. Modernisation hasn't really caught up with either of them. Glengyle is a bit more modern, but it's been designed and run by the people who operate the really old one. So we only know how to do it one way. So they've all got that common factor. And I do think maturation in Campbeltown plays a little bit of a difference, or a little bit of a part in creating that character as well.
I always get a smoked salmon note out of both Springbank and Glen Scotia, and I think that has something to do with it as well. And I'm not sure where it comes from, but I always get sort of a little smoked salmon note as well. As Greg points out, the Campbeltown funk, and Jens, Springbank is unique. And we have questions. David Owen, any idea what the name will be for the new distillery? And Donner Pass is going, Hazelburn would be a good name, as it was a standalone distillery in the past. Might you go back to something from the past, or is it really too soon to say?
Yeah, we'll probably change our minds about a dozen times between now and actually building the place. So it's probably not right to say that we've reached a decision. There are some ideas, but we'll see. We'll see. Reviving an old name from the past is certainly an interesting idea. Personally, I'd be in favour of doing that if it was on the site of the original distillery, as we did with Glengyle. If it isn't, then I wouldn't. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Okay. Some of our listeners occasionally get a little snarky, and Tyrone Cote in Nova Scotia is one of the classics when it comes to that. He's tweeted and posted on YouTube, I'll bet they bought parts from the 30 former distilleries at Campbeltown at yard sales over the years and finally have enough parts to open a distillery. Either one of you guys want to take that one and shut him down real quickly?
I think we took the parts from many old distilleries across Scotland to build Glengyle. So if there were parts from any old Campbeltown distilleries, they'd all be at Glengyle. And they aren't, so no.
And Greg wants to know, is there really still room for other distilleries in the Campbelltown area? If I could, I'd open one there, he says. Yeah, there's got to be room, but there's not an economic justification yet, right?
Well, it depends what your reason for building your distillery is. You know, are you building your distillery in order to attract as many tourists? If you are, great, build it near the golf courses in Fife. Are you building your distillery to make a peaty whiskey that you know there's a market for already? Great, build it on Islay, except for the fact Isla's probably about to sink with the number of distilleries that are going to be there. You know, there are more distilleries and more plans for distilleries on Islay than probably anybody who lives on Islay wants, because they don't have the infrastructure to cope. They don't have the people to staff them. They don't have the housing to accommodate people who would move to the island to build them. So, very biased, being from Campbeltown and stuff, but I don't see why more people aren't trying to build distilleries in Campbeltown. I'm aware of a couple of suggestions that there may be some more other than ours in the pipeline, but you know, Campbeltown's got a brilliant whiskey history. It's as good, if not better, a history than anywhere else in the country. So there's a story to be told there. There's land, there's water, there is a road. You're not reliant on a ferry. So I'm genuinely surprised, disappointed to an extent that nobody else has done it yet.
And at its peak 100 years ago, there were literally 100 distilleries in town, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got as far as licensing about 34 of them, but then when you look at all the illicit stills and all the rest of it, yeah, there was any number, yeah.
Donner Pass Whiskey wants to know how the local community in town is doing during the time of closures, as it seems Springbank tourism, Glen Scotia tourism, the Malts Festival are a big part of the local economy. How is the community doing down there?
Yeah, Touchwood, we're doing all right. There's obviously been an effect from the loss of a lot of the whiskey tourism, but the big impact or the massive impact on the local economy from the whiskey tourism comes during the festival. And so, you know, the two festivals we haven't done, hospitality and accommodation wasn't really running full pelt anyway. There was government support, and so the blow's been cushioned a little bit by that. But in general, the community of Campbeltown's doing great. There's more new shops open in Campbeltown. It's kind of completely reversing the trend that you see in the rest of the UK, where the high street is becoming, you know, it's a coffee shop or a charity shop, whereas in Campbeltown we're the opposite. You know, we've got new boutique shops opening up. The town centre hasn't looked as good in my lifetime as it does just now. So I think when people manage to get back to see us, when travel's a thing again and stuff, they'll be very, very pleasantly surprised with what they see.
Yeah, I think, just to add to that, the community itself, if anyone's been down to Campbeltown to visit the place, it's reasonably isolated. You know, Ranald says obviously it's not an island, there's a road in, but it is probably one of the more isolated towns in Scotland. And so when nobody could go anywhere, I think there was a real harbouring of that kind of community spirit where everybody looked locally to do things. And so these kind of local boutique shops that Ranald's talked about have thrived, and new ones have sprung up in between. So, you know, there aren't many positives from the global pandemic, but I think the rejuvenation of Campbeltown and the rejuvenation of the community spirit, which I think has always been there, but, you know, it's been harnessed more than ever in a time when everyone had to look inwardly and everyone had to focus on existing as a reasonably isolated community, has certainly been a positive from that regard.
And Tyrone's asking, how's the fishing? Is commercial fishing still strong in town?
Not massively, no. It's a tiny part of the local economy now. I don't know, maybe half a dozen boats at the most. But it's certainly been double figures, the amount of boats fishing out of Campbeltown regularly now, unfortunately. And a lot of those that even, you know, might be registered here are now landing their catches elsewhere, especially in the light of Brexit, where they can go and land them somewhere on the island of Ireland and they get much easier access to market than they do landing them on the west coast of Scotland. So yeah, fishing's certainly not what it used to be. unfortunately.
And another one of our cheeky comments from Dave Kuhn. When you look at the map, there's a certain humorous shape that Campbeltown and Erin make together. Does anyone there locally make light of that? And I haven't seen the map
sometimes.
recently. So.
Yeah. No, sometimes it gets a passing mention. It's just maybe arguable whether you'd rather be our part of that map or whether you'd rather be the Arran part. Depending on what you think it looks like.
Sometimes a map is just a map, guys. Come on. What else are you guys working on these days besides getting this third distillery going on and the changes to make things more sustainable over time? How do you progress knowing that it is family owned and you don't have unlimited budgets to work with? You and I, Ranald, have joked about the Springbank private plane that flew you around the world to various events and stuff, but which doesn't really exist, but we joke about that. But how do you guys plan for the future knowing that Mr. Wright, the fifth generation of Mitchells and the family, is getting on in years, and we know his plans for the future are to eventually turn everything over to the community as a trust. But how do you plan for the future?
I think that kind of future succession planning has been going on over a number of years. The guys who will, although you won't replace Mr. Wright directly, you can't replace his knowledge, his experience, maybe not necessarily his bank account either, but we're learning to stand on our own 2 feet and have been for a long time. When Mr. Wright is no longer at the helm of the company, the plan is that our current managing director, who runs the company on a day-to-day basis effectively, will step up to oversee the chairmanship of the company and make sure that those who follow him maintain it in the same manner. And Mr. Wright's nephew, Patrick, he's going to be one of the trustees of the company. So although there won't be family ownership, the family connection will be there. And again, Patrick's role will be to ensure that we don't suddenly go crazy and change the spirit, the traditions, the history, to change the way the place is run. All of a sudden try and modernize, become more efficient, decide we need 20 staff instead of 80 or anything like that. So, although there will be a change in the ownership structure, there'll be no visible change to how the company runs. And it will really be each generation's job to almost leave it in a better place than it was when they took it over. And so that's going to be the spirit that we're going to operate in.
And the goal is to preserve jobs in the community, right?
Preserve jobs, create more. Build another distillery. It creates work for local companies in the building of the distillery. It will create further long-term employment, further opportunities for young people in the town. So that's very much the goal. So that sustainability thing is about more than just the physical environment. It's about the local community. What part do we play in that? How can we continue to contribute to the development and the betterment of Campbeltown? And that's very much at the forefront of most things that we do.
We have a good question from David Owen. How is Springbank coping with Brexit and shipping whiskey to the EU? Because we know there are extra costs in some distilleries that aren't even shipping to Europe right now. How are you guys dealing with this?
This is where being small and having your whiskey in high demand really gets you a break or two. Now, it is more time consuming to ship to the EU. It is more logistically difficult in terms of information that has to be contained in labels that didn't used to have to be on it. It will unfortunately have an effect on pricing at some point down the chain. But with demand being what it is, it's not that we're not worried, but it's not going to break us. But it is making it more logistically difficult. We are borrowing staff from various departments to go and help stick extra labeling on product in the bottling hall before it leaves. We're kind of taking an all hands on deck approach to it. But we are getting product out there. Springbank always used to be the most expensive whiskey on the market in the UK and Europe. It hasn't been that for a long time. You might find it gets slightly more expensive, but not to a point where it's going to become unaffordable or anything like that.
We don't want you to get too expensive. We don't want you to get back to that more expensive stage. But
neither do we particularly. But
I seem to recall a couple of years ago we were talking about some bottling you guys released that was supposed to have commemorated some sort of battle where the Scots beat the Europeans at something, and I forget this one offhand. But I'm remembering it was a something touting independence, and I'm trying to remember this bottling. And Ranald, please correct me if I'm wrong on this one. I just have this memory of us talking about something about a bottling a few years ago that commemorated either Scottish independence or the UK's independence from Europe or something like that.
It was our Spirit of Freedom, a blend.
That's the one.
Put together. We did it initially. It was an old label that the company used to use way back in the 60s or 70s. But we resurrected it in 2014 for the occasion of Scotland's independence referendum. It was also the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce against the English forces at the time. So it was done around that kind of occasion. And then on a couple of occasions since, when there's been some form of politically significant event, we've ran off another batch of Spirit of Freedom. So we did one after the Brexit referendum, we called it Spirit of Freedom. Can't even remember the number, 60 something, whatever the percentage of people in Scotland who voted to stay in Europe versus the larger percentage of the rest of the UK who voted to leave. So it's a little bit of a fun kind of, thing that we do every now and again.
You mentioned the issues in shipping to Europe. How about the US? I know that we were talking before the show started, and your current shipment is on the water to Los Angeles, and I know that I saw today on the news that there's a whole bunch of ships lined up outside the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach waiting to get in. How's your shipping to the U.S. doing these days?
Slower than ever, unfortunately. That's probably more of a knock-on effect of the pandemic than anything, but it's a long time. Trying to get space on shipping containers is proving a challenge. We used to be able to, our national importer in the US would place an order, a shipping company would be contacted, and they'd come back that same day with a pickup date. Now we're having to chase them 3, 4, 5 times to try and even get them to estimate a date, and then they'll estimate a date, and it's usually 6 weeks later than that it gets picked up. So it's being delayed. But our most recent shipment actually landed in our importer's warehouse either at the end of last week or the beginning of this week. So product will be making its way back east over the next kind of couple of weeks and stuff. And then we're hopeful of getting another shipment out. We had hoped this month, but it's probably going to be early November before we can get space on a container again. So it's frustratingly slow, but it is hopefully moving.
That's been the hard part, is getting space on containers, because I know the container shipping business has just been completely slammed.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that makes distribution to the EU slightly easier because it's not so much container based. It's not space on ships that we need quite to the same extent. So it's the deep sea long haul stuff that's causing us bigger headaches at the moment in terms of timing and logistics and stuff.
Yeah, and I think from a production point of view, and so it's the inverse of that almost. We ship a lot of casks, bourbon casks from America for filling, and so as Ranald says, it used to be a case of get in touch at the start of the year and give them the dates you wanted casks to arrive, and it would pretty much fall on those dates. And now it's a case of we'd quite like them to come at this time, and you get a date that's maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks beyond that, and then there's inevitable delays even when that date's set. So I think from a production point of view, we've seen delays and kind of increase in the logistical complexity and the increase in paperwork and increase in fees in terms of getting casks, both from America and sherry casks from Spain as well. So, we're still able to do what we need to do. And I think, as Ranald touched upon there, it just adds an extra layer of something that you might not want to have to consider because life's hard enough.
How do you deal with that, Findlay? How do you deal with the lack of casks when you need them? Because you only have so much tank space to put new make spirit into.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with not a lot of suppliers, but a few to give us that freedom and give us a bit of a buffer and a safety net. So we buy casks direct from America and direct from Spain, but we also buy casks from companies within Scotland as well that have maybe bigger demands and bigger distribution networks and a bigger kind of lead time built in. And so we try and kind of split that between both those avenues so that we've always got it covered off. Touch wood, we've not run into any issues yet, and I hope that we don't. But it certainly is something that is becoming more of an issue. You have to think further and further ahead and put the orders further and further in advance. And those dates, those delivery dates aren't as hard and fast as they used to be.
And a lot of the bigger guys have bought up distilleries in the U.S., so they get first crack at those casks from those distilleries. That's something you don't have the option to do as a small family-owned distillery, right?
No, that's right. But I think the thing that stands us in reasonably good stead is that, as Ranald touched upon, we've maintained similar networks of purchasing casks for years and years. So there's an inherent relationship there between both us as a distillery and bourbon producers or bourbon cask suppliers and sherry cask suppliers. That means that we've been here for 200 years. They know our demands through the years. We're reliable. We're unlikely to be going anywhere, and so that gives you a bit of favour in terms of I know these guys. I've been supplying to them for 30, 40 years. They aren't going to drop to the bottom of my list of people to supply just because times are getting tough. In fact, they're going to stay near the top because they always pay on time and they're they're consistent in what they do.
We should note that you guys also make a blended scotch, the Campbeltown Lock Blend. And Greg wants to know if there's any chance to see a Campbeltown Lock Blend bottled at 46% with an 8 to 12 year age statement. He has some 40% NAS Campbeltown Lock. How's that one doing?
Greg's asking all the right questions. Campbeltown Lock, as our blend, has kind of been allowed to kind of fall by the wayside almost over recent years. The cost of acquiring stock to produce a blend of that quality was becoming such that it was very difficult to hit the right price point. So we used up the stocks that we had and then kind of let it lie for a couple of years, just let it kind of go away. But it's going to be coming back over the next few months. Rather than as a blended Scotch whisky, it's going to be a blended malt Scotch whisky. And we have got stocks from all distilleries and all types of distillation in Campbeltown. So we are going to blend those together. We have, Findlay and I work together to blend Springbank, Longrow, Hazelburn, Kilkerran, Glen Scotia into what is the new Campbeltown Loch blended malt. It'll be at 46%. It will be no age statement because the ages of the different distilleries or the different spirit runs will vary from time to time. But that will be coming to market gradually. I think it'll be in the UK first, might make its way to Europe, and then we'll reach stateside, hopefully at some point over the next 6 months-ish, depending on where things get to. But that's the plan for Campbeltown Loch.
Well, we're just breaking all kinds of news tonight on this show with you guys.
The problem people have is if they don't ask us the question, we won't tell them the answer. If someone asks us, we'll tell them most of the time.
And Olivier wants to know, will there be a new 14-year-old cask-strength bourbon wood anytime soon?
We don't have any immediate plans for that. We tend to work to a rolling 5-year program of what we would call our limited releases or our special releases or one-off bottlings. So in the next 5-year plan, there isn't something along those lines. But Findlay and I think it's fair to say, are both big fans of Springbank from bourbon casks. I think you get the natural character of the spirit in a much more prominent way. I think a Springbank from a bourbon cask is really essentially what Springbank is. I know a lot of the old, well-loved Springbanks that were bottled in the 90s, a lot of them are pretty heavily sherried. Great whiskies, absolutely, but are they as obviously connected to the Springbank new make as, say, that 14-year-old bourbon wood that we did a few years ago was? I wouldn't say so. I think, that kind of 10, 12, 14-year-old bourbon cask stuff, for me, is Springbank in a nutshell, or at least the essence of what we distill. So we're looking at ways we can get a more prominent bourbon influence into our range of bottlings. The new batch of 12-year-old Cask-Strength, which came out in the UK this week, for the first time, it's 100% bourbon matured. It's normally been more on the sherry cask side, but due to the kind of stock I think Findlay's had available, we've gone full bourbon this time, and it's none the worse for it.
Is it fair to say that a lot of those pre-2000, let's say, sherry casks had some Paxaret in them?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, we couldn't guarantee that it didn't. In general, I think those whiskies, they are part of what made Springbank's name, what built our reputation. The old 100 proofs and those things. But were they specifically Springbank? For me, not really. They maybe represent what Springbank used to be like, whereas the more bourbon cask stuff is a bit more like this. This is what we make. This is how it should taste. More natural, more robust, even. And although there's always a place for a good Springbank from a good sherry cask, our 15-year-old Springbank is very much the representation of that. I'm keen to try and find a way to introduce more of a bourbon matured element. I know Springbank 10 is probably about 2/3 to 3/4 bourbon cask matured in its recipe, but a good solid bourbon matured is definitely something we're keen to do.
Another good question from Whiskey Canuck. Trying to source casks in this environment, are you hesitant to get casks from countries, and I'm going to add in, or distilleries that you haven't bought from before, or is that a chance to add a new flavor profile to the mix?
Yeah, I think there's a few things at play there. So the first part is, kind of as we touched upon, a 200-year-old distillery with established roots to cask of people we've worked with for years. We know what we're going to get when we fill Springbank into bourbon from guys we've worked with before, and Springbank into sherry from guys that we work with on a frequent basis. When you introduce something new, it's not just that you don't know what you're going to get, it's that it's years before you know what you're getting. So it's that thing that butts up against it, which is the kind of traditional nature of making a certain type of spirit or operating in a certain way, and that desire to be a bit more experimental or try things that are a bit newer, but you don't get the results of them for a long time. And so I think we're always open to working with different people or different cask types or trying different flavors or filling on a small scale, but it'll probably always remain on a small scale. I don't think there's any great desire to suddenly go crazy and start filling things widely outside the mark of bourbon and sherry and some of the more traditional cask types that whiskey are put into. It's certainly, from my point of view, technically interesting to see what happens when you put Springbank into a cask type that you've not used before, but whether it's commercially interesting or something that particularly interests the wider public, I'm not too sure.
Okay, there. People are. Go ahead.
So you could ask Findlay about that time he filled some casks that weren't even made of oak. A guy who's hesitant to go too far beyond the bounds of tradition. That was an interesting experiment.
Yeah, we at the behest of the aforementioned managing director, we saw some casks that were made of acacia and cherry wood and chestnut and that kind of thing. And from a technical point of view and a purely experimental, what's going to happen here, it was really, really interesting. I think from how you go about setting a long-term plan of filling casks and making recipes, and why whiskey may have ended up being filled more in oak or only in oak rather than any type of wood. I think we learned a few things from that. We're still in the infancy of that process, but I mean, it's just different. If we were a brewery, for example, you could put out a batch of new beer that you trial with, and you'll get the results straight away, and you'll get the feedback, and you can easily scale it up. With whiskey, you've always got that lag time, and so you aren't always afforded that luxury of time, and nor do we particularly want to be taking spirit away from bourbon and sherry when we know that it makes a fantastic dram into something that we may need to, it might be an experiment that we have to call off after 4 years, or we have to try and blend it out. It's a tough balance.
We've had a lot of questions over the last couple of minutes and debate over the ppm level of Springbank. There are some folks who are saying 12 to 15 ppm, but they'll say it better than Greg will, for instance. And folks asking me to ask, what is the peating level of the Springbank malts? What do you guys peat to, or is it even really worth talking about?
It's definitely worth talking about because it has an effect on the dram that the guys are tasting. I mean, I think anyone who's visited the distillery will know that the kind of malting and kilning process are all done by people, very much trying to follow a recipe and a procedure, but there's a lot of human interaction there and judgment, and when something needs to be moved from on peat to off peat and that kind of thing. So we do 6 hours of peat smoke for Springbank malt, and we're kind of aiming for 10 to 50 ppm. That's somewhere in that bracket. Now, we do take samples and we do get them analysed. The nature of how we do things in terms of the batch nature of the process of making the malt, the small scale, the different times a year, and the different guys that maybe happen to be on shift, we're never going to hit a consistent level. But I think 10 to 15 is probably a reasonable number to label beside that.
Any comments from you, Ranald, on that one?
No, I mean, absolutely. We've always been aiming for that kind of 12 to 15, 10 to 15 types of level. I think one of the interesting things, certainly when you're dealing with a relatively small level of peat like that, is that how prominent that comes through. By the time you've distilled, matured, and bottled the whiskey, it can vary quite a lot. That 12 to 15 ppm is in the malt. By the time it gets into the spirit, it's much lower than that. And then how much of that peatiness comes through in the final dram can depend on the cask types we've chosen for maturation, can depend on a number of factors. So it's a useful guide. But as with all things Springbank, and I've seen a bit of chat in the comments about batch variation and stuff, there is a massive degree of batch variation, at least if you compare a 10-year-old Springbank to a 10-year-old from a much bigger distillery that's got a much wider pool of casks to pick from, much more, or different ways of controlling the consistency of their product. You do get batch variation with Springbank, but we're all right with that. It reflects, as Findlay says, the nature of our production. It reflects, it's part of what makes us, so to speak. So yeah, we never ever give exact answers to these questions because you could turn up on any given day and prove as liars. So it's best to keep it vague because it is a little bit vague.
Well, I think it works because Springbank is that quirky distillery of Scotland that batches are going to vary, and you live with it and you like it. And as I've pointed out before, you guys don't have to do much marketing because it pretty much sells itself. And that's what makes it unusual and unique, is that you guys don't have to put a lot of muscle behind it in terms of marketing and sales because the people out there love it. And that's what makes it really good.
Yeah, and we really appreciate that. We appreciate that we've got a whiskey that we all like, but we appreciate even more that so many other people do as well. Because, you can't profess to know everybody who drinks your whiskey, even on as small a scale as we do, but we believe that the type of person who is drinking Springbank, they're the type of person who sits listening to Findlay and I on a web chat. They're the type of person who goes on a distillery tour. They're the type of people who attends a whiskey festival anywhere in the world. They understand, or they care, or they're interested a bit more in what makes a whiskey different. They don't necessarily want to go to the shop or to the store. Oh, sorry, dog just wrecked my setup here. They don't necessarily need their Springbank to taste the same every time they buy it. They appreciate the variation. They might say, well, okay, the last bottle of 10-year-old I had wasn't as good as the previous one, but they'll still try the next one because it might be even better. There's that level of interest in the dram, and not just in terms of wanting it to taste the same every single time. They're open to new things. If you drink Springbank, you probably know what an independent bottler is. You probably have gone into whiskey that bit deeper than somebody that wants to buy their 12-year-old malt from the same distillery and have it look the same, taste the same, smell the same every single time.
And as our pal Frank Scott in Fredericton, New Brunswick points out, do not change a thing. It is perfect as it is. Our good friend Greg wants to know, and this brings up a perfect question, is he qualified then for the Springbank School? Another excuse to meet Frank again. He's half kidding, but what's the status of the school, Findlay, going into 2022? I know you couldn't hold it this year because of COVID, or last year either, so you've got a bunch of folks on a wait list, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously the 2020 was a no-brainer in terms of cancelling it. We did have a look at 2021 at a very macro scale, but we just didn't think it was any way possible to do it. We also didn't think it was probably morally right to invite people to a small remote community from as far afield as some of the whiskey school people come from. But certainly, and Ranald, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's an appetite to bring it back as soon as possible, starting next year. The waiting list never goes down, but certainly when you don't run it for 2 years, it gets bigger and bigger. And so I think that if we can do it in as safe way as possible, that protects both the people that come to visit and our staff that spend the time with the guys to show them how it's all done, then it's a great experience for people who come to do it. Our guys love it because, generally the people that sign up to the whiskey school are so interested in whiskey that they'll pay money to come and make it. And so they love to share their thoughts on, what it is about Springbank that they love, and they learn new things, and they're always asking questions. And the kind of other part of it is you end up creating a lot of ambassadors for the company out the back of that you don't need to pay any money to. They've lived it, they've seen the guts of the place, they know how it all works, and they just want to tell their friends or anyone else involved with whiskey what they loved about it, why they found it great. And so from a PR point of view, you couldn't really think of creating anything much better than that.
And it is really the only distillery school still operating. Brookladdy doesn't do theirs anymore. The Spirit of Speyside Festival does theirs once a year. But you guys do the school all summer long. And everybody that I've ever talked to that has done it has just been raving about what they learned and how much fun they had. And I've got to admit, it's something I've got to do one of these days, is come over and spend a few days with you guys and do the school and try that out. And just to learn and just to have the experience. And I want to thank you guys for joining us. Findlay Ross, the Director of Production at Springbank, Glenn Guile, and for J&A Mitchell, and our pal Ranald Watson, who I keep running into at whiskey festivals here and there. The last time we saw each other, Ranald, Christchurch, New Zealand, about a year and a half ago, right before all hell broke loose.
Absolutely, just when they were on the verge of declaring COVID-19 a pandemic, and we all managed to get home just before things went really crazy, I think.
Well, it's great to talk to you guys again, and I can't wait till we can all get together and share a dram together in person again. Thank you for joining us, guys. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks very much for hosting us.
Cheers, Mark.
Cheers.
And thank you for watching tonight. That's the Happy Hour live webcast. Sandy Hislop from Chivas Brothers joins us on the podcast this weekend. He'll be talking about some of the things they've done with Royal Salute and with the Chivas blend as well, the main Chivas Regal flagship blend that you're really familiar with. But we will have that on the podcast this weekend. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next Friday night. Good night, everyone.